Hi, everybody. My name is John Palumbo, and I want to thank you for tuning in. I'm a member of Crossroads Church in Staten Island, New York, and I run a ministry called Freedom Ministry that incorporates the Bible with the 12 steps of freedom ministry so we can attain freedom from our hurts, our vices, our hang-ups, and shortcomings. It's about going from the person that the world taught us to be and being transformed into the person that the God created us to be. Okay? Now, I'm telling the story because maybe you've been on my YouTube page and you've seen some of the Freedom Ministry lessons. Maybe you've seen some of the preachings that I've done at Crossroads Church or some of the Freedom devotionals. And I thought it would be a good idea for me to share a little bit about myself and some of the things that God has delivered me from so you could understand um, the passion that I have for this ministry. How God delivered me from alcoholism, low self esteem, codependent issues, and a host of many other things. Now, I'm titling this series Future Glory because in Romans 9:19 it says that I consider the present suffering that I'm going through will not be compared to the future glory that will be revealed in Christ Jesus. And we all go through sufferings in this world, and we all go through challenges in this world. And one thing that God showed me was that although when I finally did come to Christ, I was between a rock and a hard place, and I was going through some mental anguish and some anxiety and some suffering at the time, it did not compare to where I am today and where God has taken me from. So that's why I titled it Future Glory Now. When it comes to telling our stories, there are lives that are transformed by God that are more dramatic than mine. There's some lifestyles that were less dramatic. I want to point out this is not a war story, okay? It's not a competition as to who lived the more sinful life. It's about the story of God's grace on us and while we were lost and how God redeemed us and changed us and forgave us because of his love for us. That's what's important. Now, when I became a Christian, it seemed like I went to sleep one way on one day and I woke up praising the Lord the next. It was like an overnight transformation. It seemed that way. But the truth was, it was a 7-year run from 1988 to 1995 in which God was chasing me and I was actually running from him because I was not ready to give my life over to Jesus Christ at that point in time. This is going to be a 7-part series, and I hope you enjoy it, and I hope you can tune into all of them. And I hope the story blesses you. Today is going to be part one, where we talk about Friendship Day. Now, I grew up on Avenue X in Brooklyn, in Gravesend, Brooklyn, which was predominantly an Italian neighborhood. And I had an aunt and an uncle that were born again Christians. My family was raised Catholic. I was raised Catholic, devout Catholics, and my mother was a devout Catholic. Me, I was more Catholic by name than anything else. I really didn't go to church. I did all the sacraments as far as that went, but it didn't really stick with me. But I always believed in God. So whenever my aunt and uncle who are now born again Christians, my aunt Carol and my uncle Dominic would invite me to church, I didn't always say yes, but every so often I would say yes. And on this particular day in May of 1988, I was 19 years old, and they invited me to what was called Friendship Day. And I decided to go. So the church was called New Jerusalem Christian Church, and it was in Gravesend, Brooklyn. And I drove there, parked my car out front, went in, sat down, and it was very different than the Catholic Church. They had a musical band on the stage where they were singing praise music to God, and people were jumping up and down, and they were happy, and it was just like almost like a party going on. I mean, if you ever felt that you were going to go to church and fall asleep, this was not the church you were going to fall asleep in. Let's just put it that way. So I'm watching around, I'm looking around the whole church, I'm trying to take it all in, everything that's going on, trying to comprehend what's going on. And eventually the pastor came on the pulpit on the stage and he started preaching. And as I'm watching him preach, a thought went through my mind as I'm watching him. And the thought was, would you want to do what he's doing one day? And I quickly dismissed the thought as if to say, why would I even think that? And my answer was absolutely not. I don't even know anything about the Bible. I'm just here to make my aunt and uncle happy. And when I walked in, I remember they gave me a Bible. It was a burgundy Bible, and in the Bible it said Friendship Day, New Jerusalem Christian Church, and it had the date on it. It was in May of 1988. And after the service, I saw a guy there named Al that came from Avenue X. We called him Brother Al. He was about 8 years older than me. And he became a Christian when he was 18 years old. And he recognized me from the neighborhood. So I went over to say hello to him after the service. And he asked me how I liked it. And we were talking, I said it was interesting, a little bit different, than what I'm used to going to church. And he asked me a question that kind of took me back. I was like, why would he say that? He said, John, you never know what God could have in store for your life. Who knows? Maybe one day you'll be up there preaching God's word. And the reason I got taken back was because a little bit earlier during the service, that thought went through my mind. Would you want to preach one day like the pastor's preaching? And I said, absolutely not. I was like, was this a coincidence? Why would Al just out of nowhere say this to me? And I answered by saying, Al, I'm very happy sitting in the back row, and I basically never went back. I was 19, like I said. I was doing things and hanging out with my friends. We hung out in a Chinese restaurant on Avenue X called Moyen. And I would go in there at 10 o'clock at night on Friday and Saturday nights. The kitchen would close, and the manager, Richie, would keep the restaurant open for a couple of hours so neighborhood guys could just go there and, have some drinks without interfering with his customers that were there, the patrons that were just looking there to eat. So it became like our own little private place for 2 hours. Now, at the time, the drinking age kept getting pushed back from 18 to 19 to 21. I kept seeming to be chasing the drinking age to be able to drink legally. So Richie knew I wasn't legally able to drink, so he would not allow me to buy any alcohol in the restaurant. However, I had older cousins and I had older friends that were in the restaurant. And as long as I wasn't personally buying it, what he didn't know didn't hurt him as far as the way he looked at it. As long as somebody was buying me the drink or whatever the case may be, he'll go, Johnny, what are you drinking, Coca-Cola? I'd say, yeah, Richie, Coca-Cola. And that's as far as it went. But meanwhile, I was drinking Bacardi 151 with the Coca-Cola, 151 proof rum. Okay, and as the night would progress, he would close around midnight, and then me and my friends would go out to Bay Ridge. We would go bar hopping, and that was basically my lifestyle. And growing up, I was never the type of guy that looked for serious relationships with any type of girl or serious girlfriends or anything like that, because I had commitment issues. My parents divorced when I was 3 years old, and I just never believed that I would get married or that anyone would be able to come into my life and that would just be, in my life forever. Like, I didn't think that was in the cards for me. So I would go out with my friends, get drunk, drink, have a good time, and basically, very carefree attitude, carefree mentality. Um, a little bit about my parents before I close. I don't have too many memories about my father, but the few that I do have, they weren't pleasant. He was a violent drunk, and he had a lot of bitterness and rage inside of him. He was an alcoholic, and these traits would expose themselves when he was drunk and intoxicated. He would get into fist fights. My mother would call the cops on him. I remember I would see him fighting on the front lawn with the police. He was always getting into fights. My mother's brothers would come to our rescue, and he would be getting into fights with them. And there was just a lot of drama that went on as a result of that. He was the youngest of four children. He had three older sisters that were a lot older than him, and his father died when he was 2 years old, as far as I know. So he grew up in a house with four women, and maybe, to overcompensate being around so many women growing up, he tried to overmasculate himself by drinking alcohol, smoking cigarettes, and doing all the things that, men did in the 1950s. And as a result, A lot of resentments and rage that he had inside of him came out when he was drinking, and he became a very violent drunk. And my mother would leave him more than one time. She would leave him a few times. My mom also grew up in Brooklyn. My father grew up in the Midwood section of Brooklyn. My mother grew up not too far in the Gravesend section of Brooklyn. She had three older brothers, three older sisters, and a younger sister. She was one of seven. And she met my father at a church dance in Bath Beach, Brooklyn, called St. Finbar's. And they met there, and the two of them got married. And not long after they were married, the alcoholism and everything started to reveal itself. And my mother left them a few times with me, after I was born. But the clincher was when my mother took me to a pediatrician one day for a routine checkup. And the doctor asked my mother, he says, "Were you fighting with your husband recently?" So my mother was puzzled, like, how would he know this? So she answered him and she said, "Yes, me and my husband had an argument last night. How do you know?" He said, "Because your son's heartbeat is going a mile a minute. He is totally stressed out and he's experiencing anxiety. And I'm going to tell you right now, his nerves are shot. I could see it in his vitals. If this keeps up, your son's going to have some problems when he gets older." When my mom heard that, she packed her bags that day and she left him for good. Now you got to realize this was 1971. I was 3 years old. Divorce was not common. So this was something that was going to put me in a unique situation, not having my father living with me. Had this been 2001 or 2021 or 2011 or any time in today's world, that doctor would have probably called child care services. Okay. ACS probably would have been called, and there would have been a lot more drama going on because of the situation that I was growing up in. Now, we lived in Massapequa, New York, in Long Island, where I had a big backyard and a front lawn and a back lawn. And we moved to Brooklyn, where that was all replaced with concrete. Okay. And it was about starting over. And we landed in 11th Avenue in Brooklyn, living around there. My mother had a brother that lived on 13th Avenue. He was my Uncle Anthony. He was my godfather. He baptized me. His wife was my Aunt Louise. They were my godparents. They had 6 kids also. They didn't live too far from there. So my mother moved around that neighborhood. And we stayed there. We bounced around that neighborhood a few times until I started school and I started making friends and I started to get adjusted. And there was a lot of kids on the block and I was making friends. And even though I felt a little inferior to everyone else because I was the only one that didn't have their father living with them. And I would make up stories and say, well, my father works nights and he sleeps all day. That's why nobody sees him. Because everybody would ask me, how come you don't live with your father? Like I said, in 1971, 72, 73, this was not the norm. Okay. And it made me feel very inadequate and it made me feel very insecure. And as a result, I started having problems sometimes making friends because I would always look to try to make up stories to blend in, and I was always afraid of being rejected, and peer pressure became a very strong point in my life of trying to always blend and fit in with other people, and it was making me become antisocial. Now, from there, we moved when I was 9 years old to Avenue X to be closer with my aunts and my uncles. And I had a lot of cousins there. And being an only child, my mother thought there were some cousins there that were my own age. I can grow up with them and it would be something good. But when we moved there, again, I moved about 4 times from the age of 3 to 9. And I was just disgusted with life at that point. I says, you know what? I didn't want to move. I didn't want to leave my friends behind where I lived. I started kindergarten. I was going over there. I was now going into the 4th grade. And I felt like I'm starting all over. I didn't want to make new friends anymore. I didn't want to do anything anymore because I felt, why bother? First, my father's in my life. Now he's not in my life. I got friends and kids on the block my age, good friends that I'm getting established, I'm going to school, I'm having a good time and making the best of a bad situation. And now I lost them too. Why even make friends? I'm probably going to lose them anyway. We're probably going to move again. And like I said, I began to shut myself in and I started to become very antisocial as a result of that. And I didn't want to get involved in doing anything and with anyone. I'm going to stop right there for part one. I think that gives you a pretty good idea of some of the challenges I faced growing up. And we're going to talk more in part two about, which I titled Dishonor Your Father, which I'll talk a little bit more about my relationship with my father and how I started to come out of this shell. I hope you could tune in for that. Thanks for tuning in.